Hello and welcome to this keynote lecture with Professor Michelle Murphy on pollution, colonialism and reimagining chemicals. This is the first keynote of the AusSTS 2021 workshop, and this year the Australasian workshop is a multi-sided gathering with nodes in Melbourne, Sydney and Darwin and Wellington. The workshop is sponsored by the Deakin Science and Society Network, the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, the Australian Academy of Sciences National Committee for the History and Philosophy of Science. What else do we have on here? Top End STS, the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University, and the Centre for Social Research and Health at UNSW. And lastly, but not least, the Centre for Science and Society at Victoria University of Wellington. What an assemblage of institutions. My name is Timothy Neale, and I'm a DECRA Senior Research Fellow in the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University and the convener of the Science and Society Network, an initiative to support interdisciplinary research. I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm standing in this particular slice of Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. As an uninvited guest on their country, I thank them for their generous hospitality and acknowledge that they've never ceded sovereignty and remain strong in their enduring connection to land and culture. I'd also like to pay my respect, given this networked, distributed conference, pay my respects and acknowledge the First Peoples of all the places that people are beaming in and listening from. This keynote marks the first event in the third Australasian STS workshop. In 2019, the workshop was convened here in Naarm, Melbourne, featured keynotes from people like Cordelia Fine, Jack Halberstam, and a keynote conversation between Jack Halberstam and J.R. Latham, as well as a film session and panel discussion, and 12 great sessions of papers. In 2020, the workshop moved, like much of our social worlds, into online platforms with 4 workshop sessions on participation in research, disruption and STS research and digital life as an archive. And now here in 2021, we are both digitally distributed and meeting in place, networked through platforms and gathering in nodes like this one here in Melbourne. Those of you joining on YouTube can't see, there's a room of us here in Melbourne. So we are a widely situated practice, to recall this year's theme. So let me take a moment to publicly acknowledge the incredible crew that have put together this working assemblage. Tao Fan, Emma Cavall, Michaela Spencer, Mia Harrison, Max Saw, Kathy Bao, Neethi Bawate, Jennifer McDonald, Kirsty Howie, Courtney Addison, Sophie Adams, and Matthew Kearns. A quick rundown of the structure of today's keynote. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Professor Michelle Murphy, who is going to give a 40 to 45-minute presentation, and then we'll move to some discussion and Q&A. I'll be chairing the discussion here in Melbourne and on Zoom, and Emma Cavall will be moderating the YouTube live chat. So we're keen to hear your questions and hear some answers. So you can either post questions on the YouTube chat if you're following there, or send them to us on Twitter. We're at AusSTSgrad, or use the hashtag AusSTS2021. Okay, without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Michelle Murphy is a professor of history and women and gender studies at the University of Toronto, where they are an STS scholar whose research concerns decolonial and feminist approaches to environmental, reproductive, and data justice. They are Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Science and Technology Studies and Environmental Data Justice, as well as co-director of the Technoscience Research Unit, which hosts an Indigenous-led Environmental Data Justice Lab and is home to social justice approaches to science and technology studies. She's the author of 3 books, Sick Building Syndrome and the Problem of Uncertainty, Seizing the Means of Reproduction, and The Economization of Life, all published by Duke University Press. She's Métis from Winnipeg and a Métis and French-Canadian family. So with all of that said, I'll hand over to our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Tim, Emma, and Tao. I appreciate everyone's effort in organizing this and inviting me. I've got a lot of echo. Okay, let me see. That's better. I think so. And I'm really excited actually about this network and to come visit you across the West to kind of settler colonial spaces and figure out how we might connect in decolonial approaches to STS. I'm having a lot of echo. I don't know if someone needs to mute or it's me.
No, you seem to be fine for us.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Tim mentioned, my talk today is going to be and this is work I've been doing for about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years now. It's slow work, and I want to share with you kind of where I'm at. So I'm going to be mostly talking about this place. I'm coming to you from Toronto, or Toronto, which is Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory on the lower Great Lakes. And lots of the work that we're doing is about a place about 3 hours away called Chemical Valley, Ontario's Chemical Valley, where some 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. And Chemical Valley is on a river called the St. Clair River that runs from Lake Huron to Lake Erie, so between two of the Great Lakes. The other side of the river is the United States, so the river kind of cuts across two settler colonial nations. On the south side of the river is Detroit on the US side, and on the north and Canadian side is Ontario Chemical Valley. And Ontario's Chemical Valley is, along with Toronto, is on the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. And Chemical Valley is on Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe territory. And both the Anishinaabe Confederacy and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy came together in the early 17th century and made this agreement or treaty that's manifested not in the form of like a paper document with words that's like signed, but through this wampum belt made out of quahog shells. And this agreement is to kind of peaceably live together on the lower Great Lakes in a way that allows both people to share a territory, but also to think about the generations yet to come and their ability to live on this territory. So the idea of like having one dish that you all have to live out, eat out of together, and like how rude it would be at a dinner to like take more than you share and not pass it on for the next person, but that dish has to move not just in synchronous time, but across generations. And that's kind of a metaphor, understanding of this amazing Great Lakes area. And so in our work, we kind of start with the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty as our way of beginning to think about how do we engage the question of technoscience, data, and chemicals in Chemical Valley. And when we think about the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, we can think about, like taking care of water, fighting pollution, and so on. But it's also just, the beginning point of Indigenous law and Indigenous jurisdiction. So this is a billboard in downtown Toronto, Parkdale, just not far from where I am right now, put up by the kind of artist collective Ogama. And it says in Anishinaabe Moan, if you start somewhere, this is where you should start. And so what does it mean to kind of take seriously the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, or Indigenous jurisdiction, Indigenous law, Indigenous land relations and land body relations as the place you must start to, for example, rethink chemicals? So this is the kind of challenge before our lab, and this is the main folks at our, or some of the main folks at our Indigenous Environmental Data Justice Lab. And you'll see on your left, that's Vanessa Gray, who's from Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and Chemical Valley is on the territory of her community. Next to her is Rena Shadan. And then Kristen Boss, who's co-director of the Technoscience Research Unit, and ourselves, and this is us at Aamjiwnaang, kind of surrounded by Chemical Valley. And our work really builds on this tradition that I'm sure people know, which is the Indigenous Science and Technology Studies tradition. And when I first started as in this field, in the 1980s, this didn't exist. And so it's been really amazing and life-giving over my career to have this field emerge, to have people like Kim Tallbear, Marissa Duarte lead the way in terms of doing Indigenous science and technology studies. And one of the ways we think of this in our lab is that we're trying to resist the way the university is obsessed with studying Indigenous people, or studying, for example, the injury that pollution causes to Indigenous Black and poor communities as its way of studying environmental violence. And instead, we're an Indigenous-led lab who works with community members to study settler colonial technoscience and study settler colonial industry. So we're kind of trying to turn kind of epistemic tables on the ways that we typically go about studying environmental justice and its relationship to Indigenous communities. And it's not just that there's an emergence in Indigenous science and technology, or growing and vibrant Indigenous science and technology space, but it's really exciting to me that there's a whole bunch of Métis scholars, so people from my community, who I'll be drawing on today, people like Max Liberon, people like Anne-Marie Consmo, and others who are also part of this, this tradition. So what I want to kind of think with you about is the ways that our academic disciplines gift us objects or concepts that might just be wrong. And when I say they're wrong, I mean they might just be not just inaccurate, but ethically and morally wrong. So what do? We're used to, in science and technologies, looking over genealogies of how objects come into being in the sciences. But I think we also have to wrestle with, in science studies, the way that we also are embroiled with the use of objects and concepts that have sometimes very disturbing and violent genealogies, and that our use of them might in fact be wrong. And I want to think about this in relationship to the theme of your conference, which is, situated thinking. And of course, situated knowledge is such an important tradition in science and technology studies. But when we say situated, we're often taking a kind of like a mapped sense of a place-based or specific historical and place-based assembly that makes an object or a technoscience formation. But even as we're being specific about situatedness, there is an implication that there is kind of one big world that we're situated in. So I also want to think against this idea of like, kind of with and against this idea of situatedness and how we might trouble it when we try to rethink objects. So this should say place-based, not elations, but relations. So where to start? When we do this kind of work of situating, and we do decolonial work, we start with the idea of place-based relations, right? We started this whole talk with like Tim's land acknowledgement, and I did my kind of land acknowledgement. And so we do, and in science, we start with a particular lab and a particular time, a particular discipline, and so on. And we do this kind of situated work, and we do this kind of place-based work. So this is where we start, but I want to, maybe push us over the course of this talk to think about, is this enough? And we can maybe start within ourselves by asking, what if there's more than one world, right? If we don't accept the idea that we're in one world, that there's a kind of one world for us to be in our different places in, then maybe place-based thinking is a problem, because it imputes the idea that there's one world, even if we have different specificities. And so we have to kind of start with something like the Zapatistas and think about remaking our objects and concepts for a sense that we want to live in a world in which many worlds might fit. Quite whereas if we say no to not just universal knowledge, but to the idea of one world knowledge, and think about, sorry, I'm like choking. Think about the idea of what would a kind of rethinking of place-based work or situated work look like for if we take seriously this decolonial invitation to understand ourselves to be in a world in which many worlds fit, to be in a world of many worlds and not a world of one world. And so if we're rethinking objects, and I want to rethink what chemical pollution is, and then we can follow all sorts of genealogies that we have been gifted. Sometimes we teach it in science and technology studies, sometimes we don't, but increasingly we teach things like Frantz Fanon as like an important thinker in science and technology studies, who talks about the importance of, for example, inserting invention into existence, to like not just critiquing, for example, the idea of humanity, but reinventing humanity. And can we kind of take up this decolonial work of inserting invention into existence, this kind of ontological politics, in a way that honors this sense of a world of many worlds? I'm just going to take a good sip of water here. So given those prompts, what I want to kind of be thinking with you is about what is chemical pollution? Can we insert invention into existence when we rethink chemical pollution? Can we rethink chemical pollution for a world of many worlds? So when we think of chemicals, we often kind of are, this is what we're taught in universities, or we're taught in high school. We kind of have things like these Lewis structures, these structural diagrams. We think of chemicals as being, for example, a set of atomic relations. They're molecules. They have particular kinds of bonds. They might have boiling points. They have like volatilities. Usually we have kind of these measures that characterize chemicals, that are universal physical properties of chemicals. So that like what naphthalene does, how it boils, is going to be like the same all around the world. We have this universal kind of knowledge of chemicals that's very molecular, very specific, one chemical at a time kind of knowledge. And we're gifted this way of thinking about chemicals often through these visualizations, right? That I want to think of as something we can push against. Do we have to accept the idea of chemicals as things that are just molecular, that are primarily physical, that need to be thought of in through universal physical properties, that need to be thought of one at a time? When I look at this diagram, what I see is the absence of all the extensive relations that go into making something like naphthalene, which is a very complicated, injurious form of pollution that comes out of fossil fuel refining. And so what are all the relations that aren't in the way we manifest chemicals habitually in technoscience? I think of this as chemicals in white space. And when I say that, I'm using the word white purposely to think about the role of white supremacy and the erasure of the constitutive violence of pollution in the making of chemicals. So this way of thinking about chemicals doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from a whole history of molecular governance. And this is here we can draw on the work of Emmett Hepler-Smith. The ways that chemicals have been made into objects of nation-state governance in the late 19th century, particularly to facilitate forms of transnational trade. It began kind of with like facilitating around the coal tar industry, but also today to facilitate the creation of intellectual property. And so why do we understand chemicals this way? Well, a lot of it is the importance of the American Chemical Society's Chemical Abstract Service and its way of abstracting chemicals, of labeling them, of making them forms of intellectual property. There's something like 15,000 new chemical substances registered at the society every day. It's a really important kind of place for informating and deciding kind of what a chemical is and what its attributes are. This is not a university space. This is really something run by the chemical industry. And so this way of informating chemicals, which largely comes out of industry activity, then seeps its way into the environmental governance practices of nation states like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, like the United States, right? These nation states that we know as settler colonial nation states are born out of the imposing of property relations onto land. They're born out of Indigenous elimination and so on. And so these are non-innocent relations. So I'm going to come to the conclusion that our main way of thinking about chemicals are part of primarily a colonial capitalist infrastructure. That is not innocent to think of chemicals as abstract and universal. Yes, it can be useful to understand like the boiling point of the physical properties, but it's also embroiled in these larger infrastructures. It's not innocent to treat chemicals as just small molecules. When you're in Chemical Valley, this is what the sky looks like. Chemical pollution is not small, right? It is not just the physical quality. It's wrong to treat chemicals one at a time. Look at these plumes. Chemicals do not exist in isolation. Yes, you can do that in the lab, but that's not actually how they are in the world. And then in this work of informating chemicals, it's almost entirely the case that the knowledge about what they do to bodies, what they do to land, is kept really separate from the ways they're informated as substances. And so, and the ways they're informated as substances is so invested in their commodity form and erases these longer relations. Okay, so if we think about all these problems with chemicals, what I want to, do is try to think, okay, what's another way of understanding chemicals? Not just to critique this form of, we could say, like chemicals in white space, but a way of rethinking chemicals that says maybe no to the universal, and that is responsible to the particularities of a place, and that's Ontario's Chemical Valley. So Ontario Chemical Valley exists because in the 1850s, this is the site of the world's first commercial oil field. And out of the oil field then formed some of the longest standing and oldest refineries for the processing of oil that exists on the planet. This is a picture of the Imperial Oil Refinery. We believe that the Imperial Oil Refinery is the oldest standing refinery in the world. That began in 1870. And it's one of 17 refineries in Canada. And the Imperial Oil Refinery, importantly, is on the traditional territory of, is on Anishinaabe land, and it's on the territory of Aamjiwnaang First Nation. So if you look at the map on the right, you'll see that Aamjiwnaang's territory originally went on both sides of the river. So on the US side, the Canadian side, it stretched from up in Huron down to Lake Erie. Today, it's one reserve amongst a set of reserves that this community was broken up into in the 19th century. Aamjiwnaang is surrounded on all sides by some 57 facilities. It's surrounded in the air by the plumes and underneath by tailings caverns, as well as hundreds of pipelines. And so we can look at this long history of fossil fuel extraction and refining here on Aamjiwnaang, and on the one hand, think, that's a hell of a lot of pollution. Up until the 1970s, it wasn't even regulated at all. And people would tell stories, or the industry would tell stories, that there was more oil that would spill into the water and on the land than would even get into a barrel. But we could also look at this history and think that, since the 1850s, Amjanong and this area of the Three Fires Confederacy has been witnessing and resisting fossil fuel extraction and doing land protection for some, over 150 years, some 170 years. So there's an incredible knowledge about what chemical pollution is and what fossil fuel pollution is in this territory. And so our work here is got a big conversation with Max Liberon's work that really tries to understand pollution, not primarily as a chemical relation, but as a colonial relation. And so, Max just released this book, Pollution is Colonialism. And we can see, for example, when we do the kind of history to understand chemical pollution, Chemical Valley, this is a map from the 1870s. On the far right, you see what's called the Dominion of Canada refinery. That's like one of the oldest refineries. That's the Imperial Oil Refinery. But if you look next to it, you see the railroad. You see the mission, right? You see the beginning of the surveying of making private property. This is 1870. This is right around the Confederation of Canada. So fossil fuel refining, chemical pollution in this way came at the very same moment as the formation of Canadian settler colonialism. They came together. So this is a video from 2017 of the Imperial Oil Refinery. And this is a flare that happened in February 23rd. And there's a flare, there's a spill, there's a release, pretty well that's noticeable pretty well every other day in Chemical Valley, sometimes every day. And in COVID, it's been even worse because environmental regulations have been suspended. So the increase of these activities, has been very noticeable. And just to give you a sense of the kind of total lack of environmental regulation in Chemical Valley, this flare happened. It's taken with a cell phone. You can kind of think of it in the same way that you capture like a police recording of cell phone recording of police violence. This is, a release that you can actually capture and see and say, this is undeniable. Well, this is the kind of the level of quality of data and information that we get when this kind of release happens. This is Imperial Oil just calling this flare a grass fire, saying no emissions were detected and there were no injuries. Now, this actually in 2021 is a lot of information. The amount of information on a flare release now comes down to like a clause almost. You get something that's more like unit processor disrupted. Like even like 3 words, it's really reduced at this moment. But you can see that there's an incredible kind of erasure of chemical pollution and environmental violence that is built into Chemical Valley. There's some very few forms of data that's collected. There's some air monitoring that detects a small number of chemicals that are not traceable to any particular facility. And then there's something called the National Pollution Release Inventory. I believe you have something like this in Australia and in New Zealand, where facilities have to report every year their emissions of some 300 chemicals. And we looked in detail at this data that is some of the rare data in which companies are forced to admit their chemical pollution. And when we look at the data that they provide, what we discovered was that only something like 5.7% of the data given about emissions is based on any physical measure in Chemical Valley at all. Everything else of the data is based on an Excel worksheet, based on like industry produced kind of equations. And so we have the admission of chemical pollution, but the data itself is just full of bad relations. Right? It's not useful for saying something about the truth of chemical pollution. What it's useful for telling us is about the relationship between chemical pollution and colonialism. When we go into the archives of Imperial Oil, we find things like memos from management forbidding the engineers to take any measure that's not absolutely legally required about pollution. And so we can think about then this kind of data that we get from the government, from industry, not as something where we're trying to use it to prove about the existence of pollution. You don't need to. You can just stand there. You can see the plumes. You can feel it in your bodies. You can feel the sting in your nose. You can sense it on your skin. You do not need data to prove it. But we want to use this data instead to understand the relationship between data and settler colonialism in creating Indigenous erasure. So we can go look at the kind of land relations, the surveys, the making of private property, the stealing of land from Aamjiwnaang to make Chemical Valley as in continuity with, for example, that release of information by Imperial Oil. And so when we look at all this, we try to think about data as not something that's going to prove pollution, but is the evidence of something that we think of as the permission to pollute state. That it's the state and the companies together who have kind of created this permission to pollute situation of chronic emissions, for which the data is a kind of theater that's set on hiding its own violence. And this is not an accident that the company and the state works together. I don't know about all the history of Australia and New Zealand. I'd be curious what people have to say about this, but Canada, before it was a nation state, was a company. It was a charter company from England, from the Crown, called the Hudson's Bay Company. And they had a charter to come and take whatever they want, impose whatever law they wanted. And this company in 1869, 1870 turned into Canada. And so the company literally turned into, the settler colonial company literally turned into the state. So if we look at Canada, it started off as an extractive company. Hudson's Bay came to this territory to extract lumber, to take land, and to take fur. So if we look at that history about that settler, that state company relation, we see it today in contemporary extraction politics. This is another painting by Ken Monkman. So when we look at, for example, the state's criminalization of land defense at Aamjiwnaang and all across Canada, if we look at this image and we think about these plumes behind us, this is an image of the company-state relation when it comes to chemical pollution. To me, this is a much better image of what chemical pollution is than that molecular diagram. So if we start with this kind of like situated, place-based historical analysis, we get to the point to understand that settler colonialism has this company-state relation, and that this is in a very important way what chemical pollution is. So that's one way we can come at chemicals in white space. But let's take it one step further and try to go beyond place-based thinking. So can we go from place-based thinking, where we're doing this kind of genealogy and understanding this work, and move to thinking about place thought? When I say place thought, I'm drawing on the work of Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee scholar Vanessa Watts. And place thought names the kind of, and it's hard to even use words, the kind of epistemic, ontological, cosmological worldings that come out of very specific relations to land. So place thought is the non-distinctive space where place and thought were never separated, because they never could be or can be separated. Place thought is based upon the premise that land is alive and thinking, that humans and non-humans derive agency through extensions of these thoughts. So in thinking about place thought and really taking seriously Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee understandings of knowledge, and because we can say epistemology doesn't even come from humans talking and learning and teaching in disciplines. Knowledge and thought comes from land, and then we have to be studying the land. Law is not something humans make. Law comes from land, and the land is the first teacher, and we are the students of the land. So it's a whole different way of understanding where thought comes from, or even like what epistemology, and then when we are using that word, we're thinking in the wrong way is. So place thought is a way of trying to take seriously that we live in a world of many worlds. And this is a different worlding of Chemical Valley. So if we begin with place thought, we're not just saying this is not universal knowledge, this is not just local knowledge. We want to begin with Anishinaabe law, right? And Anishinaabe place thought. And that means starting with Anishinaabe land-body relations. And that means understanding also the infrastructures of settler colonialism that is invested in erasing this Indigenous jurisdiction and land-body relations. It means understanding relations as not just ontological relations or assemblies, but actually ethical. They're alive, they're filled with responsibilities, right? So we're invited into a really different way of being in relation to chemicals pollution. And then lastly, I want to think about chemicals not in a damage-based way, but in a desire-based way, which means if we're gonna bother to rethink what chemical pollution is, it's not enough, I think, to just do it in a way to try to name the violence. The version of chemical pollution that I think is needed is the one that's about affirming Indigenous sovereignty. That's one that's about bringing about the less violent world, that's bringing about the more ethical world, that's bringing us into better relations with Indigenous jurisdiction and each other, that's bringing us into good relations with the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty. So that's the desire-based approach. So can we imagine a positive kind of generative understanding of chemical pollution that its purpose is this vision of justice? It's not just environmental justice, like asking the nation state to prevent pollution, but is this sense of decolonial justice. So the desire-based, not damage-based approach. And here, of course, learning and thinking with Eve Tuck. So when we say land-body relations, then we're already in the muck of it, right? Anishinaabe understanding, this is a piece of art by Christy Belcourt, who's Métis is part of another collective called the Ottoman Collective. That's an Anishinaabe Métis kind of land defense collective. And this image, I think, gives up a sense of understanding land-body relations, which is we're not bodies on land, right? But bodies are land. We're not bodies that exist on land with other non-humans, but we are in nested relations where the other beings are inside of us. We are inside of them. The water surrounds us but moves through us. We are all manifestations of land and all its relations. So even our understanding of scale, like there's a small chemical and it's inside a body and a body is inside land, has to be thrown out if we want to really think place thought in Chemical Valley and understand how can we think chemical pollution in land-body relations in this way. And so here we look at this important work by Native Youth Sexual Health, doing this kind of work, thinking about land-body relations, to understand that violence on the land is violence on bodies because of these land-body relations. And to understand this involves messing again with scale, so that when pollution is entering bodies, when pollution is entering land, it's not just the chemical, it's the full colonial infrastructure. It's the company-state relation. It's the pipeline. It's finance capital. It's not just the chemical that's coming into the nested relations. And so in taking seriously this place thought, right, it's not even just the chemical being released in Chemical Valley, but we also have to wrestle with that. Those companies that are in Chemical Valley are Imperial Oils owned by ExxonMobil. It's Suncor, it's Shell. It's really big transnational companies, right? Originally with Standard Oil. And not only is it big oil companies, but it's these huge transcontinental pipeline relations, big transnational shipping relations, railroads that are transcontinental. We're talking about large scale imperial relations. And so place thought is not just place-based in that it's specific, right? It's place thought, but that is trying to wrestle with the incredible extensiveness of these relations of chemical pollution that become transcontinental, right? That ask us to think beyond scale into these nested relations. And then, you know, we can look at the pipelines, we can look at where the companies come from. Once we start looking at that, we quickly start to ask who owns these things. And right away, we begin to find these are owned by trading funds, they're owned by pension funds. There's a whole financial banking infrastructure that's really part of what chemical pollution is. It's really part of these extensive relations and responsibilities that's nested inside of us. The Indigenous Environmental Network here in has done really good work thinking about that in relationship to climate. We can do genealogies of all the different industries like Imperial Oil and connect them up to not just Exxon, but to particular banks like Toronto Dominion Bank, which is like a top 20 bank in the world and an important bank for funding extraction, not just in Canada and the US, but all around South America and Africa. And Toronto is one of the world headquarters for financing extraction around the world and has the most mining company headquarters anywhere on the planet. And so these finance capital relations then, I want to be part of our new model of what chemical pollution is. So if we even just take the example of Imperial Oil, we say who owns it. ExxonMobil is the big owner, 68%. Pretty well everything under that is a kind of hedge fund, an investment fund, often global. If we look at who owns ExxonMobil, it's again, you know, over half of it is again hedge funds, trading funds, investment funds. So it really is finance capital. So here's a little image I've been working on. Can't really go into all of it, but like just beginning, how can we reimagine place thought? How can we start with land and rethink what a chemical is and its extensive relations? You know, what would that look like? How do we even begin to think about these nested relations? So I kind of want to end on some images that I think do a better job than a chemical diagram to help us reimagine chemicals. This is a painting by Aura. It's called "The Land is Still Sacred." Behind the fence, the land is still sacred. So if we want a desire-based approach and really understand these land-body relations, it's absolutely vital that that land and our bodies as manifestations of land that are forced into holding the burden of this violence are treated as sacred, loved, and sites of desire. So I want to start there with my understanding of, you know, one of the ways that we understand pollution and might want to remodel it. And then I want to look at like lithographs that come out of, this is from the other side of the river over in Flint, this is still in Minor. No pipelines on Indigenous land. Is this maybe a desire-based image of what chemical pollution looks like that's calling into responsibility all these like extensive infrastructural relations? Like, is this a better image than that chemical diagram, that molecular diagram? Can we look at this? This is another image by Dylan Minor. Even from toxic spaces, we will grow strong and beautiful. Like, can we like look at this and begin to think, how could this be again a starting place to reimagine what chemical pollution is as desire-based? Or I like this needlepoint, like harm reduction is love. How can we kind of insert invention into existence as science studies scholars, deal with our place thought, and do it in a way that is part of a project of harm reduction, knowing that we're not going to escape out of these colonial relations. We're not going to escape out of, you know, the colonialism and the white supremacy of the university, but we don't have to wait for better conditions. We can start putting a different kind of politic into our place thought that's about harm reduction now as a form of love. And so here's an image. There was another refinery in Pennsylvania that was the same age as Imperial Oil. Last summer, it exploded and closed. So we were pretty excited to see that. Around the same time, one of the towers of Imperial Oil just out of nowhere fell over. We were like so super excited. Like the tower itself, like wants to fall. We look at imperial oil and we see these metal structures, and we know this metal came from the earth. It doesn't want to be here. It's even on our side. It wants to fall over. It's rust and smoke. It doesn't even want to stand up. And so when I look at then at the history of refineries in Canada, yes, there's 17 refineries. Those 17 refineries produce more pollution than the 127 in the US. But there's many more closed refineries than there are open refineries. And so we also know that these formations, which are also kind of violent land formations, these refineries, will not be there forever. They will not stand if they are not propped up continuously, if they are not continuously funded, if they are divested from, if they are not continually maintained and rebuilt, they will fall. And so that's part of our desire-based approach too. So thank you, merci, thank you. Here's some of our funders. And I want to acknowledge just the many people who are part of our thinking about chemical pollution in Chemical Valley. And I look forward to talking with you all about it.
All right.
I can't hear anything, but I assume that maybe you're gathering, people are gathering thoughts or questions.
Unmuted? Yep, all right. Hopefully we're unmuted. We are going to have some questions. That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Michelle Murphy, for that lecture. So people who are watching online, remember that you can type questions in on YouTube and they'll come through to us here, and then we can pass them on to Professor Murphy. And we've also got some people coming from the other nodes of AusSTS who can ask questions. And people here in Melbourne, if you have a question, put up your hand and you can come up and ask it. But we've got one from Tina Nata on YouTube asking you, Professor Murphy, can you please clarify what you mean by many worlds and how that might be resolved with the material reality of colonial violence, which is not merely a perspective. I guess, there are what this question is pointing to is, we can say there are many worlds, but there are also kind of hard material, chemical realities. So yeah.
Okay, so when I say that there are many worlds, I don't mean there are many perspectives, right? So to say there are many worlds is to take we could take a materialist stance about worldings, and to want to affirm that there are incommensurate worldings. And I think, if we want to be doing anti-colonial or decolonial STS, to embrace the understanding that there are incommensurable worldings that are just as material and just as real and have just as solid a worlding as the one world of technoscience in the university. So when I say that there's a world of many worlds, I guess there's several parts. One is to accept a certain kind of incommensurability. That doesn't mean that we might not be in multiple worlds at the same time. I certainly feel that way. I think there's lots of people who have a hard time, though, thinking that they might be in multiple worlds at once. It's interesting in a class to ask who thinks they're in one world and who understands themselves already to be in multiple worlds through their experience, right? They know that they're in incommensurable worlds, so they have to deal with it all the time. So one is this understanding of incommensurability, which, isn't like a sense of that you can't have any communication or contact between worlds, but understanding that there is radical difference. And secondly, is to really value and accept the materializations of other worlds. So in Anishinaabe place thought, for example, it's a very material understanding. Land is not metaphor. Land is not perspective. Land is like how all things come to matter, and is the source of knowledge and law. And so that's not a perspective understanding. And of course, in Anishinaabe place thought, violence is very real and hurtful and painful. It's also interesting to look at a classic essay like John Law's essay, World of Many Worlds, that does an STS kind of version of this as opposed to an Indigenous version of this. Could you hear me, Tim? Okay.
All right. Now I'm unmuted. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty in the room, muting and unmuting, but we can hear you.
It's perfect for incommensurable worlds. Sometimes we can hear each other and not so well most of the time.
We're trying to reach out across multiple worlds, and so I'm going to ask you a question that follows up on that, which is I guess about this matter of narrating bodies as land, and you pointed to some really amazing and powerful ways in which that is done through artistic practice, but clearly also through the work that you're doing and your collaborators are doing at University of Toronto. There's also an attention to data and how we might re-narrate some of that data, especially if we deem it to be good data. It's data that connects to a material world. It's direct, as you said. So I guess I'm interested in some of the other ways that we might seek to narrate the connection to bodies, because precisely because as you mentioned, our opponents or our chemical interlocutors say that they're doing that narrative work themselves already.
Yeah. Well, when I say that there's some data that has a direct measure, I wouldn't necessarily even say that data is like, I could then dig into that data and show you that it's a bad relation too. And so mostly what I think we're wrestling with is the way that our data-centric approach to pollution and justice is filled with bad relations. And so that data becomes not the proof of the materiality of violence. It doesn't do that work. I mean, it almost never does. And even if the data does prove, let's say, according to like a particular discipline's criteria, does that stop it from happening? No. So when we say that data is in bad relation, what we're invoking is actually Indigenous jurisdiction. It's in bad relation according to the laws, ethics, and responsibilities of Indigenous jurisdiction. That's the way it's in bad relation. And so it's not just narrating it, it's calling it into actually the place thought of that particular territory. So I guess that's one way I could say it. So it's not even just about narrating, but about understanding the relations to be ethical and not primarily epistemic or even ontological, but ethical and like forms of responsibility as well. And then where is that ethics and responsibility? It's in the specificities of a decolonial place thought. Am I kind of getting at your question, Tim? I can't hear you. I did see that there was some things in the chat, but I can't see the chat.
Okay, we're back.
Right.
Every time it's a slow delay. Yes, we've got a question in the chat, and I will ask Top End STS to beam in a second, but I'll just take the next question from Warwick Anderson, who is watching online. Warwick asks, or says, I appreciate the emphasis on place, but what about places that are not land? I'm thinking of Pacific people who feel alienated from continental arguments about land when for them it's about ocean. Isn't there a risk of projecting land desire onto other Indigenous peoples? And do we need to decolonize settler colonial critique and North American Indigenous studies? A lot of big questions.
Yeah, I think there's a couple fair things in that. So it's interesting, like, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, like, we could talk about particular, like, regional, kind of different ways of understanding place thought. But I'm not going to say that this is like then the new imperialism and every place has to have a place thought, or that all the worlds are characterized by place thought. So I wouldn't be like so generalized about that. It just, in the specificity of where I'm working, it helps me get past place-based. And then the question on land, absolutely. So it's even a problem where we work, like, sometimes, people talk about capital L land, which is, land, which includes like the airs, the waters, ancestors, generations to come. Like it's like a shorthand for a whole kind of set of relations that are not earth, soil, dirt, territory in that way. And so, there's the other, side to it is, when I showed the land body relations, that was an image of water relations, actually. Right. And so we can say, land is the first teaching. We can say like water is life. And so, I'd be very interested to hear from other scholars about like how useful is, this idea of place thought that Vanessa Watts offers, to talk about like these other worldings, and then what other words or what other kinds of ways, besides like this kind of local way of talking about land and land body relations and water is life, which is particular. What are the other, there's other kinds of place thought. I wouldn't at all say that it should be universal, but then it becomes really interesting to try to then do STS across these incredibly important decolonial incommensurabilities, who might be joined by, for example, a relation to fighting chemical molecular governance of the settler colonial state, or joined by the the pipeline, or the transnational shipping companies, or the transnational company, or the hedge fund. And so then it becomes interesting to think, where I kind of hit the butt of incommensurability as the right word, and wonder about the kinds of like solidarities and relations and et cetera that are necessary and possible across worldings and place thought, because we are engaged with these interlocking infrastructures. So I don't know, that's a kind of winding answer to a complex question.
Should we go, Tim? Can you hear us? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, that was an amazing talk, and so many synergies for the program that we've actually have happening here in Darwin. We're about to go and visit Rapid Creek, the central watercourse of this place, and indeed engage with, in a way, multiple relationalities enacting this place. And I think people are grappling often how to work at the intersections of these enactments. And what also seems to become hard is when there's a careful ontological politics happening, but that's so hard to make visible within standard forms of liberal democratic politics. Yeah, and so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about sort of making present publics that can see an ontological politics. And so I was meant to flag, we also have one other question after this, but yeah, I'll just leave it.
That's a great question. So if we kind of like the work that we do at our lab, lots of it is not at all even done for academic sharing. That's not its point. It's not for getting written up. And yeah, it's, you know, what does it mean to do this work in a way that tries to refuse the university's desire to, the invitation to us to like extract from our own relations of trying to do the good work and give it something that's not safe to give, you know? So there's a lot of sides to what we do that I don't talk about, or that we don't publish, or that, you know, it's not at all for that. We also do land defense work. So we, you know, people in the lab are active land defenders. So when I showed that painting by Kent Monkman of the criminalization of land defense, that's also what happens in the lab, is things like that. So so it is really tricky to like it is not, in a way it is very difficult to do this work and try to like offer it up in a way that's not going to be harmed by a liberal politic of extractive knowing. And of course I think it's imperfectly done, you know, like to even just do it in the university at all has that kind of risk inside of it constantly. Like we can't pretend that's not the case. And then, you know, this is also just like to kind of continue with the other kind of question, the line of thinking, which is, you know, we have this word incommensurability that's used in decolonial theory and it's used in science studies. And I wonder, like, it's useful. And I wonder about its limit, like to describe, you know, what does it mean to like try to do land defense in some kind of relationship to the university in a world of many worlds, like, and I'd be curious, like, to hear about like how people how they feel about incommensurability as a word. Like, it's important to affirm the radical difference, but it doesn't get at, I think, the ethical relations that are very connective, despite like across difference. I don't know if that kind of gets to some of what you're thinking about in that question at all, but
Thanks.
Hi, Michelle. Yeah, thanks for your lecture. It was really, really great. And I've just got a bit of a follow-up question to that, where I'm curious about what you think infrastructure is, and I'm wondering what how infrastructure can travel as a concept, if it can move between these different worlds, and its value. Yeah.
I tend to think of infrastructure in a like there's you know, obviously at Chemical Valley, like if you walk, you literally see, like, you'll see a dozen pipelines stacked up along the road. You know, you see the smokestacks, you see the, you know, the facilities. So you have all these like classic forms, the trains, literally, you know, of infrastructure. But again, I feel like that understanding of infrastructure is invested in erasing its own relations. And So for me, I'm trying to think of a kind of infrastructure that has to be brought into responsibility, right? So that the relations that make up the infrastructure include, for example, the finance capital, right? And is brought into then the jurisdiction, right, of the particular territory it's on. And that also includes settler colonial law is part of the infrastructure that, makes, Chemical Valley. So I end up wanting to bundle the state and the kind of state relations, including law, in this understanding of infrastructure, because it's the non-innocent prop that's erased. Nothing would be there if the settler colonial state wasn't propping it up in this way, wasn't invested in a certain kind of permission to violence, a permission to create early mortality in this way. So my sense of infrastructure has this kind of extensive sense, and then secondly, that these relations are ethical, their responsibilities, and they're on particular jurisdictions. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about infrastructure. I'm trying to bring it into this relationship to particular place thought, and kind of confront its erasures. Should I look at the chat? Emma says, can you speak a little on the counter data you've been collecting Chemical Valley and how you produce ethical data? So we have an app that we've built, kind of with Amjadong community members and for Amjadong users. Our app actually doesn't collect any data. We refuse to collect data. We will only support Indigenous data sovereignty. So we will support Amjadong's desires to collect data. But we ourselves, we don't collect any data about Amjadong. But what we do is we take an abundance of data that's produced by companies in the state, as well as produced by different disciplines, from ecology to medicine to toxicology and so on, and try to bring that data into good relation. So, what I emphasized was kind of mapping the way that data has bad relations, but can we reassemble data and try to bring some of it into good relations? So, for example, any chemical that a company has to report on, they have to report on it because there's already been not just hundreds, sometimes thousands of studies about like the health effects of that chemical. And, you don't need every community to like expose its wounds to say that chemical pollution is harmful. So how can we draw on this legacy of messed up work, this messed up damage-based work, and try to bring it into good relation, right? As part of Indigenous people studying Chemical Valley, studying what the state is doing and calling that state and those polluters into right relations. So Amjadong, for example, has started doing its own notices to facilities about violations of and their own sense of environmental violations. So they've been kind of enacting their own law in like over COVID, particularly because the settler state is completely retracted from all environmental regulation. So I guess that's kind of what we're doing, is we are not just trying to name the bad relations, but we're asking, can we bring any of this data into a better relation that is useful for land defense? Tim, I don't know if you want to take over with another question. Or should I stick with the chat? Okay, well, Tim's figuring that out. I'm going to just continue and go to the next question in the chat, which says, I just would like to know your opinion about energy consumption. Oh, Tim, should I answer this question?
Yes. And
what is the responsibility of consumers?
Mhm.
The richest 10% of the world's people responsible for 40%. Yeah, so I'm really keen on these ethical and responsibility and accountability forms of understanding chemical pollution. So we can look at it in terms of like, where does consumption happen? I tend to look at it more in terms of like the companies and the banks. You know, we are often, like, even let's say in Toronto, which is like a wealthy city, people are forced to work to live, right? And you can be kind of, in order to live, you can be forced into consumer relations, like buying shitty bottled water and crappy food, because that's what's available, that's what you can afford. Even as those products, the cheapest products, are caught in the worst relations. So I think it's really important, on the one hand, to take a non-judgmental stance to people's coping with how to live in a messed up world, and coping with the, you know, precarity and conditions, and at the same time, and then kind of understand ourselves to be in, it's not just that the company's in responsibility, we are also in responsibility. Our lab must be responsible to, for example, the Dishes One Spoon Wambu Covenant. We must be responsible to Indigenous jurisdiction. We have to be responsible to Aamjiwnaang, and we cannot overstep. And so it's not just that it's about accusing others of having responsibility. It's doing work where we try to get kind of hold a kind of clarity and center on our own relations of responsibility in our work. So I'd say something like that, like, yes, I'm with you, and I like these kind of accountability frameworks, and it's important to like hold ourselves in them too, as being inside, not innocently inside those accountability frameworks, whatever they might be, from the place thought to see.
That possibly leads well into the next question. So we're having a dynamic where I have to unmute, and then 30 seconds later it lets me speak.
Why don't you stay unmuted?
Because then there's an echo. So I'm going to lean on my colleagues in the Northern Territory and Wellington and elsewhere to ask questions. But I'll take the mic while I'm unmuted. We have a question from Anne Fredrickson, which I think is one I hear periodically about, you know, people who want to do this kind of work, but they exist within these colonial institutions. So the question, I'll just read it out, is I would love to ask if you have any advice for researchers, especially PhD students, within the inescapable colonial university, which constantly asks us to explain and justify our livelihoods in terms of solutionism, scalability, impact, applicability, I'd also say fundability, citations. Invariably, however, those terms are narrow and they're ungenerous in who we relate to, as opposed to thinking of research as harm reduction. So there are strategies, tactics, ways of negotiating this kind of, this grasping, narrowing logic?
Mhm. That's a great question. I mean, universities are colonial institutions, and at the same time, there's often important legacies of people having long worked within and against them, legacies of working in the crevices or doing work despite the university or within and against. And so there's a whole, I think, genealogies of these kinds of traditions. And, when we started our lab, we spent 6 months just figuring out how are we going to be together. So so what I would say, how do you do it is, one, you cannot do it alone. You need to do it in some kind of community and figure out like the responsibilities. And that doesn't mean like finding a community you're trying to like rescue or something. It's mean like starting where you're at, right? And figuring out your relations and your responsibilities. But you have to do that with others. You can't do it all by yourself. And then it's slow work. So we spent a long time, and lots of people dropped out because they don't want to spend 6 months thinking, what are our values? How are we going to hold a meeting? What does it even mean to like sit in this room? How are we going to eat? Like we literally spent so many weeks on these kinds of questions, right? Which is like these basic questions, like how are we going to be here in a good way? What does that look like? Who's here? What's our responsibilities? So that's how we started it. And that's how I would recommend and that's a survival strategy, right? Because it's not just that the university doesn't, wants your work to be a certain way, but, the university is kind of like harmful. And unless you kind of have your survival strategy to protect yourself from the ways that it wants to call you into bad relations, you're going to be a conduit for reproducing bad relations, So why are we here? And, sometimes when I say this kind of stuff, people think, well, I need to do this to get my grant, to get my job. I don't know what the job market's like in Australia. The job market is not great in academia. Like really, if you're doing work on environmental justice, you're doing work for the world, like for a reason, like because something matters. And, I sometimes get even a little annoyed, like about like, losing sight of that. Like, why are we spending our life force on this work? Well, it has to be because it matters. And I think that, look at all the people at this conference. There's so many people who want to value together work that matters. So I think there's like a weird fearfulness that the university kind of like wants to invite us into about not like doing its most conventional forms. And look, when we're at the most conventional kind of talk, like I almost want to fall asleep, don't you? So I think like, so it's like a multi-part answer, like, you have to do it with others. It goes very slow. You start where you are. It's not about rescue. It's about understanding how like these things are killing you too. And you start from there. And if it matters, then it's going to matter.
Thanks so much. It was fabulous. I'm going to jump in with a question from down here in Aotearoa, if that's okay. I saw Vanessa Aga-Jones' name on your list of people who've influenced your thinking and who you've worked with. And so my mind immediately pings to sort of chemical kinship. And I was really struck by how you just traced the chains of ownership that actually like literally invest in and allow these massive extractive industries to continue and to continue growing. So I'm curious about, whether the language of kinship does something for you in this context, what language you want to use to talk about relations, good relations, bad relations, and how that might relate as well to like some of the representational work you've been doing, you know, talking about data, but then also actually picking up this amazing visual imagery to open up how we think about chemicals. Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do find Vanessa Jones' idea of chemical kinship really important. And, you know, if we look at that work, you know, she was looking at Martinique, and part of what she was wrestling with was plantation owners feeling a kinship with, you know, Black workers who were joined on the one hand by being in the wake of slavery and in the presence of anti-Blackness, but yet also in a relation through chemical violence. And so this is not, this is like to be in a kinship with beings and structures that are hostile to your very existence, right? So this is an important thing to remember about her concept. It's not about kinship of like, oh, intimacy and happy friendship and, you know, positive attachment, right? It's about that we are also forged in violent relations. We're forged out of these hostilities. And so, yes, there's a kinship with imperial oil. You know, my own family's traditional land has a gas station by imperial oil on it. So yeah, and then on the other hand, also I am white. I have responsibilities to my whiteness. I have responsibilities to living in the structures of whiteness and its kinships. And that includes calling white supremacy into its ethical relations, calling it what it is. And that is also part of that kinship. So yeah, I think kinship's really useful as long as we just don't fall into the warm fuzzies and understand that, like, you know, these kinds of things are born of violent kinships, and those kinships then bring responsibilities that are hard for us to do, but that we're called into doing. And there are also, you know, there's beautiful parts to it too. It's not all, then there's the warm fuzzies too, but it's not only warm fuzzies.
So we're just going to jump in and help Tim out to ask the next question.
Thank you.
How do we challenge data worldings that deny the reality of pollution? There are many worldings, but there are also just lies that become worldings. How do we challenge these?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like, when it comes to pollution and data, a lot of it is outright lying, gaslighting, fraud, purposeful fraud, and so on. And, you know, it is really important to expose those things. And that even within the logic of the world with one world, they are fraudulent, you know, unethical forms of data. ExxonMobil is a real architect of that. Yeah, I don't think to me it's not a problem. And you know, I live in multiple worlds. One of the worlds I live in is the world that likes to present itself as the world of one world. And that's the world of, you know, the normative university. And I live there too. And so I don't have a problem arguing, like, I think it's really crucial to expose like the fraudulent data practices that are like integral to making, you know, the regularity of exposure to early mortality and harm so pervasive for so many communities and people and beings. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's my thought about it. I think it's crucial and important work to do, but then I think it's not enough, because we could spend all day saying the data is a lie and not get anywhere. And that's why I also want to kind of think about this desire-based approach. What does it mean to like be trying to do work that's not just about calling out the bad relations, but trying to pull in and amplify and affirm and build up and thicken something better. And so that's why, you know, I just think it's not enough to do it. I think it's important to do, it's just not sufficient in and of itself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Michelle. We have one more question from the chat, which I'm gonna read out, and then I'll pass back to Tim to wrap up. So this is a question from Elsha Lawson-Boyd, who says, what happens after the towers fall? How do we live on with or after the damage?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a great question. And I'd say, you know, for like maybe most people, one is already living on in the damage. Like, I would say that all this work is autobiographical, you know, for myself and every person on the team, like, and not just for ourselves, but like maybe generations. And so that's what we're already doing. Living in the wake of colonialism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy is already living, you know, trying to live in the damage. And that's why I ended with, we will grow strong and beautiful in toxicity. We will love the land behind the fence. That's not, those aren't just, those are really meaningful things to me. That's a really important part of the work, because that's where we are, is you know, doing work out of hurt, and so we have to have this kind of holding, like it's you know, it's interesting to see where in science studies and where in scholarship people are willing to use the word love. But, you know, I think that it's an important part of, can we have a day of chemical pollution that has a relation of love to damaged being? That's, in a way, that's like the desirous approach.
I have time that I'm using, I think. Well, thank you so much, Professor Michelle Murphy, for joining us. Thank you so much. That was incredible. And thank you for bearing with us through our technical difficulties, Professor Murphy and everybody else, everybody here in Melbourne, and everybody joining online. So I will wrap by thanking Professor Murphy again, and thank you everybody for joining us for this keynote, and thanks again also to the AusSTS workshop sponsors, the Deakin Science and Society Network, the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, the Australian Academy of Sciences National Committee for History and Philosophy of Science, Top End STS, and the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University, the Centre for Social Research and Health at UNSW, and the Centre for Science and Society at Victoria University of Wellington, my hometown. So those of you attending the AusSTS workshops, I know you have a great couple of days ahead. And remember, please, to tune in tomorrow for our keynote conversation between Anne Galloway and Kane Race, which will be chaired by our colleague here at Deakin, Karen Pina. So thank you again, and maybe here in Melbourne we can give a round of applause for Professor Murphy. And we are no longer on YouTube. Yay! We survived.
I just